The man at the front of the column saw it first. A gate, tall, steel, crowned with rusted letters, Yedem Dasein. To each his own. Beyond it, the trees fell away, revealing low barracks, gray concrete, and something else. A smell. Something thick and rancid that clung to the throat and refused to be swallowed. Private Charles Lynch dropped his rifle to his hip and gagged. His sergeant said nothing, only stared past the wire fence, his jaw tight, knuckles white on his weapon. They had seen bodies before, torn by shrapnel, burned in tanks, blown apart in foxholes. But this was different. The bodies didn't look human. They were stacked, naked and twisted, against the barrack walls, some with bones poking through parchment-thin skin, others eyeless, mouths frozen mid-scream. Some weren't even bodies anymore, just pieces, ashes, smoke. The 6th Armored Division had arrived at Buchenwald, and hell opened its gates. April 11th, 1945. As the American tanks rolled through Thuringia toward Weimar, they met light resistance. German lines had collapsed in the west. Villages surrendered without a shot. But the rumors, they grew louder. Civilians whispered of a camp on the hill, something worse than war, something no one wanted to see. The GIs assumed it was a POW facility. Instead, they found one of the largest concentration camps in the Reich. But by the time they arrived, the camp was already in revolt. Inside, a small network of communist and political prisoners had risen up. Using stolen weapons, handmade knives, and sheer desperation, they had overtaken the guards left behind, those too slow or too arrogant to flee. The SS had evacuated the bulk of the inmates, marching them eastward to die, but over 21,000 remained. The Americans didn't know what they were walking into, until they heard the voices. A chorus of moans, a child's whimper, a cracked voice calling in broken English, "You are real!" The gates swung wide, and the truth spilled out. The camp was not silent. It groaned. It wept. It stank of death. Sick men hobbled forward, reaching out with skeletal arms. One clung to a corporal's jacket and collapsed, sobbing, into the mud. Others didn't speak at all, just stared, eyes wide, hollow, unblinking. Some had no reaction at all. They had already retreated somewhere else inside themselves, unreachable. The barracks were overstuffed wooden shelves, 8 men to a plank, stacked 3 high. No mattresses, no pillows, just lice, rot, and the weight of despair. In one block, a GI counted 50 corpses. In another, they found a man who had been dead for days, yet none of his bunkmates had moved. Or maybe they couldn't. Outside, on the roll call square, blood still stained the gravel. Guards had executed dozens before fleeing. The corpses hadn't been removed. The inmates had no strength left to bury them. The crematoriums were still warm. Ovens the size of vaults stood blackened with soot. Inside were bones, partially incinerated. Skulls, charred. Ash collected like snow on the floor. And on a nearby table, human skin, stretched tight over lampshades. A face preserved in a jar. That was the moment one of the GIs snapped. He dropped to his knees and vomited. Another screamed at the German guards they'd captured, pressing his rifle to a man's neck, demanding answers, but the guard only smirked. One soldier raised his pistol and pulled the trigger. The bullet missed. Barely. The officer watching didn't reprimand him. He didn't speak at all. Buchenwald wasn't a death camp by official designation. There were no gas chambers here. It wasn't built to murder en masse like Auschwitz or Treblinka. But it didn't need to be. Death came slow here, lingering, through starvation, typhus, beatings, freezing, hanging. A gallows sat in the center of the compound. Children had been forced to watch executions, sometimes of their own parents. Medical blocks held horrors that shouldn't exist. One GI found a stack of photographs showing prisoners before and after experiments. The first image would show a man. The second, a wound gouged into his thigh, untreated. The third, his body, lifeless, mouth open. Nearby, in a chamber marked Kinderblock, they found dozens of boys, Jewish, Roma, Polish, some as young as 6. They had been subjected to medical trials, injections, surgeries without anesthesia. Most had stopped speaking. One boy stared into the soldier's eyes and muttered, "Ich bin kein Tier." I am not an animal. General George Patton came 3 days later. He was a man carved from war, brash, battle-hardened, born for the field. But as he walked through Buchenwald's gates, he stopped speaking. His aides said he turned pale, then green. He made it as far as the crematorium before stepping outside and vomiting behind a bush. Eisenhower followed soon after. He brought cameras, not to exploit, but to witness. He knew there would come a time when people would say it hadn't happened, that the stories were too awful to be true. So he ordered documentation, photographs, film reels, witnesses. And then he ordered the people of Weimar to walk through the camp. Men, women, children, teachers, merchants, bakers. All of them made to walk past the stacks of bodies, the torture cells, the skeletal survivors. Some collapsed, others wept, a few refused to look. The smell alone made several faint. Still, Eisenhower forced them forward. "You must know what your country has done," he said. "You must see it." The survivors were barely alive. Medics came next, dozens of them. They set up field hospitals inside the camp, opening their kits inside old SS buildings. GIs carried out the worst cases, men with infected wounds, gangrene, open sores. Every third person had typhus. Most were too weak to stand. Feeding them was its own kind of danger. Some hadn't eaten in weeks. The medics had to feed them by spoon, slowly, tiny sips of broth. Giving them too much too fast could kill them. And it did. Some died even as they were saved. A young woman named Rivka had survived for 3 years in Buchenwald. When the Americans came, she cried for the first time since her parents were taken. She drank too quickly from a GE's canteen. She died the next day. He never forgave himself. Some survivors would go on to speak. Elie Wiesel was among them, 16 years old, a face like paper stretched over bone. His father had died in the camp, his mother and sister long before. He was liberated that April. Years later he would write, "Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, which has turned my life into one long night, 7 times cursed and 7 times sealed." His voice became the voice of 6 million. Others never spoke again. A boy named Marek was found under a blanket in the children's barrack. He had survived 3 camps. His back was covered in scars. He smiled at the soldiers. He died in his sleep, never knowing freedom. A Polish man named Jakob insisted on standing to greet the Americans. He collapsed, face down, 3 feet from his bunk. They buried him with his striped shirt still on. The Americans marked the graves with makeshift crosses. They didn't know their names, but they remembered their faces. The numbers would come later. Over 56,000 dead at Buchenwald between 1937 and 1945. Shot, beaten, starved, tortured. Doctors kept records in ledgers, precise, cold, efficient. But the men who liberated the camp remembered something else. A girl gripping a dead body, refusing to let go. A pile of shoes, tens of thousands, all sizes, all shapes. A drawer full of gold teeth. A wall marked with scratches, counting days, prayers. One simply said, "Mama." When the GIs left, they didn't talk much. Some didn't sleep for weeks. Some developed tremors. Others went numb. They had fought Germans, stormed bunkers, marched through gunfire. But this was evil. Not just death, not just war, evil, calculated and proud. One man, years later, said, "We didn't liberate a camp. We interrupted a genocide." The footage taken at Buchenwald was shown in American theaters. Audiences sat in stunned silence. Mothers covered their children's eyes. Some left early, some couldn't look away. But everyone remembered. And when the war ended and the trials began, the films played again. The photos were entered into evidence. The names of guards, doctors, and commanders were read aloud. Some were hanged. Some escaped. But the evidence never faded. Today, Buchenwald is a memorial. Visitors walk the gravel paths where prisoners once stood for roll call in the snow. They see the ovens, the gallows, the barracks, and they see the names. So many names, but also so many left blank. Because the Nazis tried to erase the evidence, tried to burn the truth, but they failed. Because the Americans got there in time. Because the survivors remembered. Because the cameras rolled. And because men who'd never planned to be heroes became the only witnesses left between the world and forgetting. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.